Think you know Cuba? Think again.
Since the revolution of 1959, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a country of contradictions.
A poor country with world-leading human development indicators. A small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance.
A weak and dependent economy that has survived economic crises and the United States blockade.
Frozen in time, but pioneering in medical science and climate change adaptation.
Formerly ostracized, but with millions of defenders around the world.
Despite meeting most of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba's socialist development is not upheld as an example.
We're going beyond the headlines to explore those contradictions.
On Cuba Analysis, we dissect the facts, we put things into context, and we get to the root of the issue.
We challenge assumptions and ask, who's shaping the narrative? Who benefits from the story?
Join us!
This
is Cuba Analysis. Johana, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Firstly, I would just like you, could you please introduce yourself and explain to me how you came to the role you have?
Well, my name is Johana Ruth Tablada de la Torre. I'm Deputy General Director of the division that is in charge of United States issues here at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. From this building, we conduct Cuba, foreign relations, or most of the foreign relations with more than 190 countries all over the world. And Havana also is the host of more than 120 embassies from all over the world. So I'm telling you that this is a busy place and we have a busy work. And I've been working with the US for a long time. I'm an ambassador as well. And I've worked in US permanently and in Havana in different occasions working with the US, but in the past also with Europe. When I joined the Foreign Service, it was at the European division. I have two children that are not children anymore. They are 24 and 21. And I'm married also with a colleague. We're together to school and we're still together.
Felicidades. Okay, so what are the key features of the United States relationship with Cuba, both historically and then more specifically today?
This is a big question and I will try to answer not too long. But I think that the key feature, if I have to choose one thing that will define US-Cuba relation, I would say that on US end, the obsession of controlling Cuba, of dominating Cuba, of deciding out of different pretexts that Cuba either is too small or we are too close to them, so that they do not recognize the right that Cuba has to live and develop as an independent sovereign nation. And on the other end, we Cubans who fought so many decades and years for our independence from Spain have been also very determined to defend the right that we do have as Cubans to develop our country on conditions of independence, of full sovereignty, and also social justice. And the main obstacles for patriots of Cuba from different generations since the 19th century and before till today, in fact, has been those efforts by different United States government over more than 200 years to control the future of Cuba, the natural resources, the economy, and even, as we can see now in the new times, even the way that we Cubans will reflect and think about ourselves, since we live in a moment when perceptions are more important than realities. You see United States wasting millions and millions of dollars every day in trying to establish the narrative of what is going on between US-Cuba on terms that are pretty much Hollywood terms. The bad guys, the good guys, the bad government, the tyrants, the freedom fighters, and in most of the occasion, the stereotype and the product that is presented to the public, which is extremely manipulated for political reasons, is exactly or almost exactly the opposite at what it really is. So I would like to thank you. That has been, for many years, I've been watching. This is the first time that I meet you personally, but I've been following, as many people I'm sure that are in favor of to put an end to the abuse of U.S. against Cuba, your work. And I think this is an opportunity for our voice, the voice of the Cubans that are defending Cuba in a very difficult situation, will reach more people, and I'm very happy to be talking now. Another moment that is important, of course, is the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, because Cuba conquered, in formal terms, its independence in 1898, but immediately was occupied 4 years by the United States. That ended that fight between Cubans after 30 years fighting Spain. When we won the war, United States entered at the last moment. They always talk about the right fruit, which is a political doctrine of the United States, opportunistic, which is not new, and I think still pretty much characterized like Monroe Doctrine, the way the United States behaved in the Western Hemisphere. But in 1898, when we kicked out the Spaniards and the Americans came over, we kicked out the Americans because Cuban patriots fought 30 years. So our new republic was, and I think is another feature of the relationship, was born with an appendix that was an amendment that was added to our Constitution by a senator from Connecticut, Oliver Platt, that will grant United States the right to enter and intervene militarily in Cuba every time American interest was at stake, or what they consider, and also establish the Guantanamo Bay, so famous for the torture after the 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, and even right now because of the plans to fill it with migrants without committing any crime and all those things. So in 1959 was the first time that Cubans could fulfill the job that our independent fighters, Mambises, couldn't finish, because we got independence without sovereignty, because United States between 1902 and 1959 controlled 70% of the lands, controlled the telecommunications, the electricity. So it was Fidel and his group of rebels that, and different associations of the Cuban society that was against the Batista dictatorship, that put together our first successful effort to develop Cuba at it not pleasing any foreign power, but responding to the claims of our population and introducing a tremendous set of very popular and important social justice measures to put an end to the inequalities of lack of opportunity that characterize the history of Cuba, when the majority of the population, the more humble people, had no access to higher education, to better jobs, and that was and since day one, those were plans that immediately stand in front of the plans of the United States to continue controlling Cuba. And since day one, different governments of the United States, some of them with tactics of engagement or engagement with sanctions, other sanctions plus sanctions and coercive unilateral measures, extremely cruel, but that the policy of aggression, the economic war, the disinformation, the diplomatic isolation attempts has been characterizing that history.
Thank you for that excellent explanation. So you mentioned sovereignty, and the blockade violates your sovereignty all the time. So how would you explain the US blockade to someone who's completely unfamiliar with that? So what is a blockade? How does it function practically? Why does it exist? And how is it exterritorial? So trying to break it down.
I'll try to keep it simple too, although it's not simple. I will try to demonstrate with a few examples that the blockade is today the most sophisticated system of unilateral coercive measures and more comprehensive that existed on Earth. Because of the scope of the sanctions or coercive measures that has been added, it's not a legislation of one day. It's been volumes and volumes of decisions, both executive decisions of different US presidents and legislation from Congress in order to prevent a country to develop at its real capacity with the purpose of overthrowing that process and recover the control of Cuba. So from day one, and it's very famous, the Mallory memorandum, the logic has been pretty much the same. Is if the United States, that is the closest neighbor and is the number one, now probably this is in dispute, but it's supposed to be the number one power in the world, will declare an economic, financial, commercial war against a small third world nation, it really has the capacity to prevent that country to develop at its full capacity. It really has the power to interrupt process according to whatever were the plans that the country has for itself. Because, and it has also, because your question is very important, the power and the capacity to intimidate, because people could say, well, okay, United States is not trading with Cuba, and from now on, I'm going to start mentioning what is it inside. Let's say the blockade is an egg. What is inside that egg? So there are all sorts of regulations preventing US and Cuba to trade in both sides, preventing, there is an exception, and I will refer to that exception later, but there is also a regulation that make it impossible to Cuba to export any item to US and prohibit United States to export every item or any item to Cuba, with the exceptions of food since 2000. But we're going to get back to that. Because but the rest, from fruits and industry products and medicine and all sorts of items that you can imagine that in a powerful economic nation you can get reactives for your healthcare programs or laboratories to produce medicine, that Cuba produce medicine. Everything is prohibited. But United States went farther than that. The government of US prohibited that any country in the world will export to US an item that has Cuban component. Let's put an example. Cuba is one of the countries in the world that produce more nickel, cobalt, and other rare minerals that are so important in the economy of renewable energies today, to mention an example. Well, if we wanted to sell to Japan that nickel or that cobalt or that product, if they produce a battery, that battery cannot be sold in US. Immediately, that increased the cost for Cuba and decreased the capacity of Cuba to get money necessary for its development from their foreign trade operations. But the embargo goes further than that. They call it the embargo. That's why I mention from time to time, so that your viewers will know that embargo and blockade is the same. Although it's important to establish that we call it blockade because an embargo is precisely.
I'd really like you to define that, please, because that's really important.
An embargo, it is a prohibition that will establish that you cannot trade with me. So it will be, by definition, a bilateral situation. But from the very beginning, from the establishment of the blockade by President Kennedy, it has extraterritorial impact. From the very beginning, the target was not just Cuban entrepreneurs or Cuban enterprise or Cuban productions or Cuban socialist system. It also were designed to ban others to participate or to punish third parties that participate in foreign trade or investment or relations with Cuba. And the capacity of the United States to punish is, I think, infinite, because you have at least 4 legislations. If you wanted to really have an idea which is the scope of the embargo, you have to look at the Trade with the Enemy Act. The only country on earth that this old legislation of the beginning of the 20th century is being used today is with Cuba. That legislation is the one that gives powers to any president of the United States to establish an embargo against another country. It also gives them the power to limit how long or how far those sanctions will get. So it is a paradox, but the truth is that the Trade with the Enemy Act, being the legislation that allows the President of the United States to keep in motion the blockade against Cuba, is also the one that gives power to a United States President to use his prerogative as a president to reduce the impact of those sanctions. For example, if a president of the United States would like tomorrow, without changing a legislation, he could sign a piece of executive decision that would establish that the United States will not oppose anymore that Cuba will get a dime from the World Bank. Cuba is one of the few countries in the world that cannot get a dime to programs of development of the World Bank. Same with the IMF, which is good, because everybody knows how controversial the credits of the IMF are, that sometimes they loan money to countries, but the price of giving those money and the conditions are so bad that you ended up not having any aid for development, but pleasing the transnationals and the capitalists and the powers or superpowers that would like to explode the resources of a country. So afterwards, you have the Export Administration Act. It almost prevents Cuba from buying any reactors for our biotechnology, because they would immediately politicize using those cells, saying, well, but this is a country that is an adversary or an enemy. You do not suppose to sell a product that could be used, and then immediately invented other use. Cuba is a Pacific country. Cuba hasn't invaded any country. Cuba has not a single, and I'm going to interrupt myself just to establish this. We have a very asymmetric situation. From 1959 to this 2025, that we have one of the champions, I prefer to use another word, but well, one of the champions of the abuse of the United States against Cuba, former Senator Marco Rubio, today current Secretary of State of the United States, has been one of the political figures that made his whole political career fulfill all his ambitions, dependent from the money of the groups that inherited power of the former Batista dictatorship that the Cuban Revolution put an end. So his dream for a Cuba would be a Cuba that will be under the U.S. boot, and the vote of whomever were those families that have been profiting from the lack of relationship between Cuba and United States. And the thing is that over all these years, in the last few months, he's been building more and more on top of the blockade that existed in 1962, on top of the legislations like the Helms-Burton that had the capacity of unifying in one piece of law all the executive decisions till 1996 that different presidents put in order to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and to make the life of the Cubans impossible, in order to destabilize the country, in order to provoke riots, or in order to overthrow the government and place a government that will respond to U.S. Together, if I have to, if the light goes off now, and you know that we have a lot of blackouts in Cuba, I would tell you that the U.S. policy is to suffocate the Cuban economy, to suffocate all sources of income for the Cuban population, and at the same time to run a very expensive disinformation communicational operation to blame the victim of the impact that those sanctions and those coercive measures of the country that is abusing the Cuban people is having on us. And that's why today you see all over the world the news about that in Cuba, you know, there are a decrease in the life expectancy is true. That you see that the infant mortality rate that we keep it at a level in 2021 of 4, which is unique internationally. This year was 8 out of 1,000 that is living. So we're talking, and people, the big press, international, and the one that is also paid under the payroll of the State Department, of the National Endowment for Democracy, of the Office of Global Media, of the State Department, they will portray the effect, but they will forget about the roots of the problem. They will try to separate completely how important has been and decisive the measures after measure, coercive measure, that U.S. had been taking, twisting and twisting and twisting the neck of the Cuban society in order for us to start difficulty in breathing as a society. So they are looking at the impact, and they are not looking at their tremendous responsibility that all of U.S. government, including Biden government and even Obama, that promote that he would like to leave the blockade, but he did not use all his prerogatives. The way that I was explaining, that even in the Helms-Burton, every paragraph that says Cuba cannot borrow from the World Bank, Cuba cannot buy anything from U.S. and cannot sell anything from U.S. Third countries that invest in property nationalized by the Cuban government will be punished also with lawsuits. All of those, they will forget which has been the design, and which is the purpose and which is the objective. And they also forget that all presidents of the United States, even in the Helms-Burton, after everything that is prohibited, there is a virgule that is established, unless the president dispose the opposite. So with the exception of tourism to Cuba, that is prohibited by law and is not under any specific or general license, although Americans can visit Cuba out of 7 general licenses for religious or classes or cultural events or sports or things, something that Marco Rubio would like to get rid of, the so-called people-to-people as soon as possible. They've never taken advantage of the opportunities of really alleviate out of presidential decisions. They've taken a few, but they did not change the nature of the relationship. That is maximum, not pressure, it's maximum aggression.
So you've talked to us about the US blockade as a set of legal statutes, and there are also
illegal. I think it's illegal because it violates international law. But yes, it has a disguise of legality, even when it does clearly violate international law and American law, because they even establish who can, if a vessel touch Cuba today, like the one that is arriving to the port, wherever this vessel is arriving, cannot touch United States ports in 6 months. Could you imagine? It means that Cuba, that is an island, we don't have the Pan American road like Central America, that you can get cargo in trucks. That the United States will condemn Cuba, that anyone that will dare to come to the Caribbean cannot touch U.S. ports to get cargo and go back to Europe or Asia. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, you're absolutely right. It's and also to point out, as you said, that the extraterritorial character of the US sanctions has actually been since the beginning. Those are important points. But I want to ask you more specifically about Cuba's inclusion on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which was something that was originally done in the early 1980s under Reagan, and then finally
January 21, Trump put us at the very end.
And then Trump returns Cuba. It took Obama a long time to remove Cuba as well. This has a very punitive impact and a very extensive reach. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, definitely. I think that if I have to point out which are the worst decision of U.S. government or coercive measure that for us are more urgent to overcome, or if we could decide one day what could go away first, I think that one will be the first one. Because to put a country in the very narrow and small list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism internationally is to condemn that country to a tremendous financial prosecution, which is the way it's behaving. Any international transference, even if we are buying power milk for babies in New Zealand or in UK or in Poland or in Spain or in Chile, any place, when you do that transaction and you are going to pay to the enterprise immediately, if in Wall Street that they mainly control the SWIFT mechanism, the corresponding bank mechanism that the dollar circulate international, and Cuba has a prohibition from US to use dollars internationally as well. We lose money also changing money. So when they will recognize that there is a transfer, it doesn't matter if it's a cytostatics for an oncological hospital, if it's food or if it's anything, immediately that is a transaction that will go in red, that will call the attention of all the supervisors, that will be needed a tremendous overcompliance requirement by the US government to any bank of the world, and the worst, that it will expose banks to be penalized illegally, but penalized, it happens, more than anybody could imagine. Penalize a bank of a sovereign nation for doing a sovereign legitimate transaction with another sovereign state that happened to be Cuba. So it is absolutely necessary, and that's why Cuba has been so vocal in denouncing. And the other thing, an event that is such important as international terrorism, a crime that is so serious as international terrorism, to be manipulated out of political reason, to put a country that doesn't sponsor terrorism, like my children used to ask me, on a terrorist list, is absolutely absurd, because it discredits Cuba and it makes our economy to function worse. But at the same time, it discredits the United States, because it shows the entire world that to be or not to be on that list doesn't depend of the way that countries fight against terrorism or not. But it does depend of the animosity or the desire of U.S. government to make more impossible the life of the governments that they don't like, or social system like socialist Cuba that they don't like, in order for purpose of punishment and intimidation to third countries. So this is very worse. And there are others that I would like to mention that are very important and that are wreaking havoc in Cuba today, which is the prosecution against oil. United States in 2019 set in place new coercive measures, unilateral, illegally, but they are in place to go after vessels, insurance companies, armors of vessels that are bringing oil to Cuba that we are buying. Incredible. It's the same with the prosecutions to Cuban medical collaboration abroad, because they know that by doing so, out of wasting millions in propaganda, misinformation, and producing falsehoods and lies in order to justify what it has no justification, they are able to leave millions of people without medical attention that they need, and they also know that they are harming the social, the public healthcare system in Cuba that is free of cost for the population, but it's very expensive. And they know that all of those United Nations South-South cooperation agreements are very important in order to sustain a good healthcare system for the Cuban population. Those are, and there is finally ESTA. The United States went as far as removing ESTA to citizens of 41 nations just with the purpose of harming Cuban tourist industry, which is another source of income for the Cuban population. They blatantly lie. They say that all the money that is going for tourism in Cuba is going for the Cuban military. And Cuba has reduced tremendously the budget for the military because our doctrine is a doctrine of defense. We are not like the United States that will have naval military base all over the world and that will go and invade countries. In fact, the only time that we've been abroad fighting was to end apartheid, and we have African blood. So for many Cubans, it was an honor to go back to Africa and even die with our brothers and sisters to put an end to something so horrible as the apartheid in South Africa and to free Namibia too.
Before we move on, I just want to add to your list of examples about the extraterritorial character of the US sanctions. So, for example, I have a bank account in Britain. I'm a British citizen. If I try to send Nina £1 to her European bank account, and I put the word Cuba in the reference or anywhere in the transaction, that transaction will be blocked. Despite the fact that it's not even being converted into dollars, it's not going to Cuba. That's the extent of the blockade. So when we have experienced that ourselves, we've been involved in campaigning.
And every day here we have a lot of sad stories. There are students in Cuba that participate in international contests. They win a medal and there is a metallic prize. If it comes to Cuba, they never get it. I know people that has been first place in events, international events, and they cannot collect even personally, not even their institutions, even if it is an NGO, even if it is a donation, even if sometimes it's an international organization donation, even if it is the salaries of diplomats of all over the world that are working in Cuba has difficulties in getting from their countries their salaries. This is absolutely out of control because the mindset of Marco Rubio and Díaz-Balart and the members of Congress that has Cuban origin, I already told you that their origin are very strongly linked to the tyrants that the Cuban Revolution overthrew. And that mentality of nostalgia for those fascist time in our history that provoked a lot of deaths in Cuba. In that mentality, the mindset is that the embargo or the blockade is not working because we are still moving ourselves, because we are still eating, because we are still developing vaccines, because Cuba still have results in biotechnology. We are still sporting under a tremendous adversity. That mindset is a mindset of genocide. It's the same that happened with Palestine. It's the same person. The Secretary of State of the United States, on any platform you can ask, the most serious and the less serious, which are the 10 political figures in U.S. Congress that have received continuously money from Israel over the years. Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be in the number 4 on any list. Ask Grok or Perplexity or ChatGPT or DeepSeek on any artificial intelligence that collect data, and they will put it in the first one. Saint Ted Cruz. In fact, also we are not very lucky because the descendants of some of the Cubans that are in U.S. politics today are precisely people with that fascist mentality. But he's been unconditional also to genocide in Israel every time, and I think they've received 3 times Bibi Netanyahu in Washington this year. all the conversations and hugs and kisses are about you have our unconditional support. Not a single word you hear from him. So what Cubans could expect if we've been his obsession? If he has been blackmailing presidents, including President Trump during the first mandate, the politics used to be to make Marco Rubio happy. And right now, the provocative set of unilateral coercive measures that he has in motion, including things that has no precedent, such as denying Cuban athletes the right to go to the United States for international competition. That never happened before, not even with President Bush father and junior. There always went some exception for things that in terms of civilizatory conquers, you're supposed not to do. Not anymore. 80 visas has been denied and not granted to Cuban members of national teams of different ages, in different capacity, and to the president of the Cuban International Olympic Committee. Nothing happened. And it is a way, apart from being a discriminatory, illegal treatment, it is also a way to prevent Cuba to participate in important competition cycles that are starting right now, including the Olympics. And you see that happening and not nowhere.
Cuba is the country in America Latina and in the
With
Caribbean
more
and
medals.
Latin America with most medals.
And this is a country that invests tremendously in sport as a nation, because it's one of the things that we are so more proud, like in our education, like in our biotechnology, like we did with healthcare. So they are targeting deliberately with a lot of cold blood issues that has made Cuba to gain in a justified way international recognition, doctors going out and assist poor nations or poor communities.
There is no sector untouched.
There's no sectors untouched, but their priorities are the ones that has the capacity to bring goods for everybody, not just for a few. Because in Cuba, we do believe still that that our philosophy continues to be that whatever we can be able to do together, we will give it to most Cubans, not to a 1% like they do in the United States. And this is the difference when they accuse Cuba of trafficking with doctors, of forced labor, which is absolutely not true, because capitalist societies, developed countries like the United States also will go out to other countries to do medical contracts and services. The difference between Cuba and themselves, when Clínica Mayo could do that in the United States, that is very famous, is that the percentage that doesn't go to the doctors goes to a private organization. In the case of Cuba, it goes to services that are for the entire population. It is not true that they don't have salaries. In fact, they have two, because they have the Cuban pays them their entire salary in Cuba, and they have another one in hard currency in the country. It's not true that the passports are confiscated. I work in Belize and Portugal when the doctors were completely free to do whatever they want. Some of them were the only doctors in villages that are far away from cities. Nothing will ban them from moving to another country. And
I think it's also important to mention there, because it's not just Cuba that doesn't benefit, it's also those countries where Cuba goes to those communities that are more vulnerable or that don't have, so it's not just...
And right now, this is a priority of the new government. Again, Marco Rubio has made a priority of President Trump government to go after Cuban doctors wherever they are. I don't remember how many meetings, and I'm talking of public information, of a statement that he has made in Dominican Republic, in Bahamas, in meetings with CARICOM, that fortunately has been replied with a lot of dignity from the countries where our doctors are deployed, because they say no, we are not violating any legislation. They are getting a decent salary. They are being paid. They are given a service that if you remove them from our country, no one will be there to assist, like they did in Bolivia when the pandemic was starting. Then they forced the doctors to leave Brazil when Bolsonaro won the elections. And lots of communities in the Amazonia, in the Amazonas, that have never get a doctor in front of them, lose that doctor. That immediately the presence of Cuban doctor had a tremendous good impact in the increase of the standard of living of those population, of mortality rate, of pregnant women mortality rate, and things that they even are affected now in Cuba because of the overwhelming wave of sanctions that they keep building on top of the others, with that mindset that it's not hard enough. That statement is criminal. And they've been on the news in US many times. Marco Rubio, Mauricio Clavel Caron, talking about the philosophy of saying, no, Cuba still can do things and we're going to go after them, so that no one would approach Cuba, that no one could have something that is not going to happen, because the resilience of Cubans, the capacity of the Cuban Revolution also to emerge from difficulties and reinvent ourselves with good results is also infinite. The resistance of this country and its people that support the revolution, because the whole narrative of that this is a dictatorship that with long weapons go out and take the clips of the long weapons, and the police in the street preventing people from doing their life. So there are difficulties, there are a lot of criticism also, because there are things that we as Cuban government could improve, but the mistake of a country in not doing everything well should never take as a justification for a foreign power, the most powerful military nation, an economic nation, will come and torture that nation in order to take them to a model that hasn't proved to be better than ours, by the way. Because if our socialism was a complete failure, we wouldn't be talking right now. I dare anybody that there is a lot of sensitivity now in the world when Trump announced 50% of tariff for this country. We wish one day they would say, okay, Cuba and US now will trade is 25 or 50 or 100, because we don't know what is that. Cuba is absolutely banned from that kind of transaction, and our transaction with our countries are also punished and prosecuted. So imagine any nation on the world that will be in all lists that has sanctions associated unfairly with no justification. The manipulation of human rights in Cuba has no beginning and no end. Is another travesty issue that the United States, with no care at all for human rights of the Cuban population, human rights that they are violating every day by preventing our country to move forward, are talking about that they do care about human rights in Cuba.
We actually had a question about that, so I'll move to that. So many US politicians and diplomats describe Cuba as a failed state, and they use the economic crisis to argue that socialism doesn't work. At the same time, they claim they're concerned about supporting the Cuban people, and they're concerned about Cuban human rights. So what do you say in response to those assertions?
I will reply very simple. If everything that is not working well in Cuba is our fault, so let it be. Remove the sanctions. Remove the blockade. Remove the more comprehensive system of coercive measures on air from Cuba, and let us fail at our own speed and prove to the world that it is Cuba and not the U.S. artificial conditions that are being imposed in less than 10 million people living on tremendous difficulties that are artificially created by U.S. to make us fail, the responsible of the things that are making the life of the Cubans so difficult. Because, okay, let's talk about apagones, blackouts. In Cuba, there are blackouts. I will invite government of the United States to remove the pretext. So we are the ones that are guilty for our insufficiency in providing electricity and energy to the population. Okay, stop prosecuting and putting fines in banks, in armors, in vessels, in insurance companies that are giving some service for Cuba to import oil. We produce oil, and it's almost half of what we consume, but we have to import oil, like most nations in the world. So stop prohibiting Cuba to have a normal trade on oil. Stop going after our incomes on tourism. Stop banning and prosecuting people that are coming to Cuba, because we have a unique country with a unique history and beautiful nature, and it is also a country where you can live in peace. We don't have organized crime in Cuba. You don't have the situations that in other destinations force tourists to remain in ghettos, in a key or in a condominium. In the case of tourism, love the Cuban people. So those are the things that I will reply. United States is lying. They know that they're lying. They know that they don't have the capacity to make the Cuban people surrender, even in very difficult conditions, with proof again and again our determination to defend our nation and our right to build a better Cuba ourselves. And I think that's probably the best answer. And in the case of human rights, I think that Cuba is one of the countries that has made a more serious contribution to human rights in our hemisphere. No country is perfect. And if you ask me, and in fact, those are debates that are taking place in the Cuban society. We just changed our constitution. We just signed, approved in a referendum, a new family code that was controversial, but we ended up having a legislation that is more democratic, more modern, more civilized, more than many countries that call themselves the top of the top. Our police, when the riots in July 11, the Cuban police went to the street unarmed. Just one person died, this is the other favorite topic of United States. They just sanctioned our president recently for not visiting U.S., not that he wants to. There are many places in the world that welcome Diaz-Canel with a lot of with very warm, because it's the president of a country that we can walk with our head in alto.
Held high.
Exactly. So we have nothing to be ashamed of. And they just did it because of what they called it in July 11, after they tortured Cuba with the first sets of 200 sanctions under a pandemic, when they denied Cuba to buy in U.S. products that we need for our pharmaceutical industry. And they took the pandemic as an ally, even in those conditions that people had lack of electricity, water, food, and medicine, and they went to the street. Even in that situation, unfortunately, one person died. We cannot the same to happen with President Duque in Colombia. In the same summer of 2021, more than 100 activists died on the hands of the police. Do you know what Marco Rubio and Bob Menendez, the one that is in jail now for corruption, is as corrupted as Rubio, just that the other one was caught earlier. They gave the police in Colombia of President Duque $5 million as a price to preserve the democracy. Those are the double standards of our time, and those are the double standards that are associated to the U.S. narrative that is absolutely immoral when they speak about human rights in Cuba being the one that are violating the human rights. And right now, the Cuban families, they are having a campaign of intimidation for Cubans living in U.S. not to visit their relative, for Cubans living in Europe not to visit their relative. They say, if you visit your relative in Cuba, you're not welcome in U.S. All of that with the same purpose, to affect Cuba economically, psychologically. They are gaslighting the Cuban people with hundreds of millions of dollars being wasted in their propaganda. Just recently, when they are cutting monies for foreign aid in U.S., you know who's in charge of USAID now? It's also Marco Rubio. So they have the perfect storm. They are the ones that are allocating the monies without touching the monies to waste in anti-Cuban propaganda, misinformation, and criminalization of Cuban doctors or anything good that is coming from Cuba. But those are the same decision makers that would also establish sanctions for the stupidity that they print. So they will pay you, Nina, if you are happily, comfortably in Miami and said, I give you 1 million, like they give to the lady Maria Warlau of Archivo Cuba, and said, I'm going to give you 1 million for you to produce evidence that the Cuban doctors are in labor force. You produce whatever they need. You even buy another person to produce. You do all your papers. You get your money. Then you are awarded, like she was, with an international prize against human trafficking. And the whole thing is a big lie. The money, the person that they call as an expert, the narrative, the articles in important newspaper of the world, they do have that capacity to work with transnational media that will also reproduce and reproduce the same talking points and lies of the State Department to justify something that has no justification. No country should have as a priority to go after the welfare of a population, after their medical service, after the food, after the foreign trade that will give people food, after the capacity to import goods to produce better in the country, after the energy that you use to produce, to illuminate ourselves, to teach in a school, to do our goods. But that's exactly what the United States is doing. And they will fail, again, they will fail once and again in their main objective of overthrowing a popular project like the Cuban Revolution that has legitimacy. But they, I think, has been successful in impose setbacks in our development, and it's logic, because if you cross the line of decency, if you go into the extortion of your foreign partners, if you go and find everybody who approach you, then you could have some success in making our life more difficult. On that, I will give them some credit. This is the only thing they've been helpful to in making the Cuban population, all of us, suffer for lack of goods that we have never been without. And just because of that logic of twisting and twisting, they're still running the country. They are still going to school. They are still eating. No. We really want to wreak havoc. We want them to starve.
And at really manufacturing that narrative. They've really been successful at manufacturing that narrative. I think it's so important to mention when you said about life going on, because when you walk the streets and when you go to different places, that sense of normality, that children go to school, that people go shopping, that people are visiting their granny.
They dance.
They dance, they laugh, they expect people to be miserable. They drink beer on the beach, they have a joke. And that feeling is there. It's you don't need to look for it. It's straight away when you get off the plane and when you go anywhere. That is so important. And I guess I have to say that probably drives them crazy that this still goes on. But it's very important to mention that. But it's also very important to say that Cuba has internationally very good relationships with countries all around the world, and participates in many international forums and debates. So since the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the island has punched above its weight in global terms. How can you explain Cuba's global impact, and what are the principles which drive its foreign relations?
I think that since we are not dependent on any foreign power, we get rid of the United States saying the last word in many things in Cuba. And even when we were close to the former Soviet Unions, I think it has been widely demonstrated that we were not an appendix of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union collapsed. And Cubans, on difficult conditions, we keep going, pushing forward our socialist project that always was legitimacy with Cuban roots in our own history. The foreign policy of Cuba, I think, is worldwide respected, precisely for, I will dare to say a few things. I think because it has been respectful to the international law that is being destroyed right now, thanks to the behavior of big powers like United States. It is also respected because it practiced solidarity, which we are a country that receives solidarity from different nations and people, that recognize in the Cuban Revolution an authentic process and a hope that things could be especially in Latin America, there is a before and an afterward after the Cuban Revolution. It opened new avenues to many countries to think big time, that the times that when the United States will treat us as colonies is over. So I think in that sense it was important. It also proved and demonstrate that with limited resources, if the goal is to put human dignity and people in front, in the top, and not how much a few will gain, you can also show to many that there is another way to do things, that there are alternative models, not that ours could be the best or anything. We have a country that it continues to evolve and improve ourselves, not to please the United States as any foreign power, but to please our own population that is being more demanding in the kind of society and economy that they want. And I think that the foreign policy has been also respected because it's a foreign policy of peace. In Havana, we are very proud to remember again and again that Latin America is a son of peace, and that decision was taken in Cuba. And I think it's also because Cuba has played an important role in peace process, like the Colombia, some of the Colombia peace process and many others. And even in Africa, when we militarily were involved, it was not as a country that will invade or will take resource back to Cuba. In fact, we just went and gave our blood to help them to be free from apartheid and abuse and colonialism. So I think that even today, the foreign policy of Cuba continues to be worldwide respected by countries of different ideologies or models, because we also respect others, and we are not going elsewhere imposing the way that we have our own model, and we are trying to improve it here. But we're not even in U.S. We would like to see U.S. But we won't go and interfere like they do all the time, meddling into internal affairs of any country. You're seeing what U.S. is doing now with Brazil, with Colombia, with you name it. They will go and immediately get in trouble with other countries just because they are behaving in a way that doesn't please the ruler class in the United States.
I think, as you say, this international respect for Cuba was shown recently when Cuba was elected as the temporary president of the Group of 77 plus China, which is the largest multilateral bloc within the UN. But also recently, Cuba has entered the BRICS. So can you tell us something about the significance of Cuba entering the BRICS bloc?
I think that Cuba has a record of, because we always has been a non-aligned country, of looking for integration into organizations that could be valuable and that could help also for Cuba to develop itself, to integrate to the international community in a good standing. And I think that in the G77 plus China, we've been an important actor, Cuba, that important issues, climate change and others, that as a humankind, we could also provide our support, even with our limited capacity. And in this case of the BRICS, as an alternative group of countries that are also trying to find alternative ways to integrate themselves and push forward from the South to benefit their people and their communities, we recognize their also an interesting, integration or movement or group, and a possibility also for Cuba that it is a country that has been artificially punished on issues as international banking system and development and trade. So anything that will come out of those efforts that will open new avenues for countries to treat each other as equal and with respect, we will be, I think Cuba will be interested. We are also in the Euro-Asiatic, Euro-Asia, other groups as an observers and in order to also participate, because we need to sell our goods, we need to import in conditions that has not been draconian, like the blockade imposed to Cuba, because you have to know that every time that we have to pay cargo to come to Cuba, those vessels know and those companies that they cannot touch U.S. port. So that normally will triple the cost for a product to be delivered in Cuba, because that operation also will be punished by 6 months away from U.S. ports. That has a cost for us. So we are entertaining different plans, our own internal plans to produce more, to be more efficient, to make our economy more effective, to make our society more fair, more democratic, to have more internal debates and think together in how we are going to get out of this situation, because hopes for the United States to have epiphany and to lift the embargo, we don't have at this time. We know it will happen eventually, because the policies of the U.S. right now are even contradictory to whatever are the so-called priorities of U.S. government. Just to mention one contradiction or paradox, U.S. says, all governments, Biden, Trump, that they don't want more migrants or irregular migration. But the policies against Cuba are precisely the kind of a policy that will produce more migration. Because if I'm cutting all your resources and all your skills and all your income and all the ways that a country will have to do things better by themselves, this is also a mandate for people living in that society to find an alternative country to live in, because people are not masochists. So there are many of us, I think the majority of the Cuban people, that still will say, okay, I'll stay, I'll fight here, I will, but probably there are most of people that will have probably conditions as a housing that is solved. But imagine there are many difficult stories. And there are people that when they see that all doors are being closed artificially, because suppose that you work in a touristic resort that used to receive people from France or Germany or Portugal, Spain, and now those people are afraid to come to Cuba because they cannot visit New York. And suddenly, from one day to the other, you lose your job because you have to cut because we are getting less tourists, or the same on other issues. You were part of a program in biotechnology that suddenly you have the research to go ahead and produce the vaccine. But you have the project, you said, okay, I have a doctorate degree for free in Cuba. Education is free from kindergarten to a doctorate degree. But I'm sure that if I sell my workforce in the first world, people will hire me. Most of the case, they will hire you. But immediately that damage also your own country or your family. So United States, by doing what they're doing, are promoting more migration from Cuba, not the opposite. And the same thing with the law enforcement mechanism that we have to fight against narcotic interdiction. Those are things that are having a very bad impact because of the policy or the state of denial of these people that are driving U.S. policy against Cuba, because the United States is also, and the Americans, and losing liberties, all the prohibition. This is funny, but it is the way it is. Where are the most prohibition? who is the one telling American citizens not to visit Cuba? It's not Cuba. They are welcome and they come. So we supposed to be the dictatorship. But it is U.S. that is preventing Cubans to visit U.S. They are not granting visas. It's U.S. that is preventing cultural delegations to go and perform in U.S. It's United States that is preventing scholars to come and teach in Cuban universities or participate. It's United States that is preventing their artists to come and perform in Cuba. It's United States preventing the Cuban athlete to go to U.S. It's United States going after third country. So which is the country of freedom and which is the totalitarian state? I think that there's again a big manipulation when they talk about that they wanted to fight for freedom in Cuba or that they wanted to make the life of Cubans better. They are torturing Cuba in a way without precedent, violating international law against the mandate of the international community that for more than 30 years has been asking U.S. to put an end on the embargo. And last year, 24 delegations also asked for U.S. to withdraw Cuba from the terrorist list, something that Biden did at the last moment, knowing probably that next president will put us back on the list. But at least he pleased some of the head of state that asked him, some of the Democratic members of Congress that consider a cruel violation of human rights to continue treating Cuba the way the U.S. is treating Cuba without Cuba having a single decision, legislation, or executive regulation harming Americans or American companies or the American government.
Yeah, and I think we have to remind ourselves that it violates so many international laws. This is not opinion. This is violation of international laws and UN convention. Like, it doesn't matter what your opinion is. These are the laws we are supposed to all agree on, you know. So before we end, I think we need to mention Palestine. So for decades, Cuba has been a strong opponent of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And since October 2023, among of the loudest voices against the Israeli genocide. How can you explain Israel's apparent immunity, and what does it reveal about the West's claim to defend human rights and democracy?
We've been very vocal, as you mentioned, against the genocide that the government of Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian population, especially in Gaza, but not so. It is a process that is not for us, or at least we look at it not as something that started in October 23, but that started 75 years ago, when little by little Israel is being dismantling the capacity of the Palestinian people to live, to survive, to develop itself, to disrespecting the international legislation also, and the two states agreement of the United Nations resolution. And on this barbaric genocide that we are witnessing, we consider, and we've been also in public calling United States as responsible, because the weapons that are being used to kill the Palestinian people are from the United States. The foreign aid that is being cut in Africa for vaccines and healthcare programs and drinking water, and it is not being safe on sending all sorts of military aid. And the diplomatic set of manipulation and international protection to the government of Israel is probably one of the biggest or the darkest chapter, I think, of human history. I don't think any of us will be the same. The impotence of the good people all over the world that has been on the street, because it's not just Cuba. We watch it in London every day. I think that the people of the world are against the genocide, but we don't have the capacity to stop it. And the governments that have the capacity hasn't used it. By the opposite, has been protecting Israel. It's like giving a free check to finish the job of making a population disappear. for no reason or for the worst reason, because so we are, many of us that study after World War II, international relations, at least I was naive enough to consider that all those things that we read after Nuremberg, after fascism in Germany, that we won't see as a human, we won't fall into the same barbaric times, but we did. And it is our call and our duty, and Cuba will continue fighting for the freedom of Palestine. We will continue denouncing in the international arena this crime, but it is true that we also think that the same people that are also condemning Cuba to abuse are the ones to be called for responsibility more and more in the United States of what is going on in Palestine.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I just would like to thank you, and I would like, because I know that since you are also very active in organizations that are in solidarity with our country, I would like to take advantage of this last minutes to express gratitude, because in the middle of so many difficulties with inflation, with the increase of the price, with the difficulties of people to find jobs or to keep it, or it moved, I would like to tell from the bottom of our heart that here in Cuba, it is fresh air every time that we see your events, your conference, your gatherings, because it gave us a lot of strength to continue fighting for something that we consider that is it is worth to continue fighting, because we are not fighting just for Cuba, and not for what we have, not for defend the conditions that we're living that are not the best, but we are fighting for the rights of the peoples of the world to build an alternative models to the neoliberal model that it wants to be imposed upon us.
Thank you. And I think just on that, Cuba is on the forefront of anti-imperialism.
Totally.
And that is one of the reasons that so many people want to support Cuba.
And with result, because as you mentioned before, there is not a single day that I don't wake up, and when I see Cuban children going peacefully to school, when I see my children going for free to the university, to college, when we see our population living in peace, there's something that we are doing good in Cuba, that even, something very good, that even under economic war, under disinformation war, under the gaslighting of the so-called Cuban platform or independent journalism that is not independent at all, is on the payroll. Now they are asking for 75 million. On this budget, they will even increase the anti-Cuban budget in Congress. Even despite of all that, you talk to Cubans and you will recognize that there is a lot of values here to be protect and defend.
Well, we also always say that for the rest of us on the left outside Cuba, we can't afford to lose Cuba, and we understand that this hostility, this aggression, this attempt, as you've said, to torture Cuba, this genocide or attempt at genocide is because Cuba represents the threat of a good example.
The threat of the good example is, I'm convinced of that. Although I'm also convinced that even in the United States, the majority of the population don't recognize an enemy in Cuba. And I've traveled to the US almost every year and talked to people that they will tell you clearly that they are okay with a small nation to organize the way that their people would like to organize. And it is incredible how special intergroups could control an issue the way that they are controlling Cuba. Even 57% in the last survey that was done late in 2024 in the United States will show that the majority of the Americans don't swallow the idea that Cuba is a threat to U.S. national interest, don't swallow into the idea that Cuba is the enemy. Many of them have traveled freely or running away from U.S. oversight through their countries, and they recognize that in Cuba there is no enemy, that Cuba is a country that deserves all this solidarity and that has gained in the fighting also and with their resistance, also the opportunity to prove without an embargo or foreign pressure that that our project, our social justice or project has the right to exist.
That's been a fantastic interview. So we encourage everyone in the United States and elsewhere to come and see Cuba for themselves. We've learned a lot, and I'm sure that everyone listening has.
Thank you so much. And finally, you know, I'm so happy because I admire your work a lot by watching in the networks, by watching you, and it gives us a lot of inspiration and strength also to see that people that are living in hundreds or thousands of kilometers away could feel so close with their hearts and their minds fighting for a better world.